I think this is going to be a fascinating conversation with two really remarkable people. I think most of us feel that some of our most fundamental assumptions about the world, and indeed now even our own country, are coming into question. Can we no longer assume that liberal democracy as a form of government is inevitable everywhere? And let me say, to be clear, that when we say liberal democracy in this context, and we'll probably start in a minute asking for some definitions, we mean liberal in the classical sense, certainly not in the partisan sense, in the sense that Ronald Reagan, President Bush, clearly believed strongly in liberal democracy. And there are, even some now questioning what has commonly been sort of sacrosanct for political scientists, that a country, once it's had a few fair and free elections, changes in government, and a reasonably strong economy, that it's inconceivable that the country could turn from democracy to something else. But now we're not so sure. And then you look at polls. There have been many polls that we've seen showing that the millennials question democracy in a way that my generation didn't. There were polls in the United Kingdom that showed many younger people think that one should have a strong leader who doesn't have to deal with Parliament. And just this morning, I don't know how many of you happened to see a poll, a major bipartisan poll, that was released by the George Bush Institute jointly with the Biden Institute at the University of Pennsylvania and Freedom House, which showed that half of Americans think the United States is in, quote, real danger becoming a non-democratic authoritarian country. And 80% of Americans are concerned about the condition of our democracy. So our topic, I think, is an incredibly timely one, an important one. Is liberal democracy at risk at home and abroad? And I think we could not find two people whose work is more relevant to these critical questions. You have their bios, so I'll be brief for the people who will be watching this online in the future. Sheri Berman, professor of political science at Barnard College of Columbia University, where she teaches and writes about the development of democracy, about European politics, about populism and fascism, and we'll undoubtedly come back to those words. And please look for her forthcoming book, Democracy and Dictatorship in Europe. She also writes regularly for many leading American publications. Yascha Mounk is a Harvard lecturer on government, a senior fellow at New America, also the executive director of Renewing the Center team at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. He has an extraordinary media presence in print and broadcast media, both in the United States and in Europe and his native Germany. His latest book is People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and What to Do About It. And you just think about that title for a moment, People versus Democracy, which is sort of a loaded set of words. And you think, well, how can people be against democracy? Isn't democracy all about people supporting the government they want? I'm going to begin with some definitions in a minute. But I saw Yascha when he first came to the campus just 2 days ago. And since then, he wrote a column on the Turkish elections, which were, of course, just Sunday. And let me just read from that. It's his column in Slate, because I think it's really a very good introduction to our topic overall. He concludes in this: the Turkish case shows that authoritarian populists can, in the long run, prove surprisingly effective in delegitimizing anybody who disagrees with them by denigrating the opposition and telling lies about critical journalists. It shows that, even if about half of the country deeply hates them, populists can stay in power by mobilizing a fervent base. And it also shows that political and intellectual elites, both inside the country and around the world, persistently underestimate the threat that these kinds of leaders pose to the survival of democratic institutions. It is a set of lessons we would do well to take to heart in the United States. So let let's begin, and then we'll start with sort of definitions of what we're talking about for liberal democracy, and then we'll talk about the status of liberal democracy in the world, the causes that lead these institutions that we cherish to be threatened as they are, and I hope we'll have time, before I open it all of you, to talk a little bit about what we do about this. But let me start, Yascha, perhaps with you, seeing as I just read from your column. What is liberal democracy and what is the threat, very succinctly?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's an important question, and you already made the point that when we talk about liberal in this conversation, we don't mean liberal and conservative, right? The way we talk about liberal, George W. Bush is as much of a liberal as Barack Obama, and Ronald Reagan was as much of a liberal as Bill Clinton. So what is liberal democracy? Well, I think it is the fact that our political system really aspires to allow people to have two kinds of goods at the same time. The first, which is connected to the liberal idea, is individual freedom. So we want to have a political system in which each of us can decide on our own what kind of things we say, which God we worship or not worship, who we want to be in a relationship with, and all of those other kinds of freedoms to lead our lives in the way we wish. And in order to make sure that that's the case, we need the rule of law and the separation of powers, so that powerful people can't just lock us up when they don't like us or when they don't like what we say. And we also need protections of unpopular minorities. So we need certain forms of minority rights. But that's not the only thing we want in our political system, right? We also claim that we are a democracy, which means that collectively we rule ourselves. That there isn't a priest or a monarch or a dictator who gets to tell us what happens politically, but that we together have mechanisms to make those decisions. And so, this is sort of obvious, right? But I think we forget about it. And we forget about the fact that our political system tries to protect both of those things, and that they can come into conflict with each other. But if somebody says, but we rule ourselves, and we collectively decide that what you say is unacceptable, and we're going to put you in jail, that's what the Founding Fathers called the tyranny of a majority. And so being clear about this double purpose of our political system and the way that these two purposes can come into conflict with each other, I think is a precondition for understanding the ways in which democracy is under threat today.
So Sheri, do you agree with that definition, and tell us how you would define the concern as you see it?
So I can build on what Yascha said. I mean, democracy is a means for choosing leaders, right? The distinguishing characteristic between democracies and dictatorships is that in democracies, the people get to vote and choose their leaders in government. So democracy has a pretty narrow meaning. It's the method that one might use, that countries might use to choose their leaders. Liberalism, as Yascha said, is something quite different, actually, and historically they have not necessarily gone together. Liberalism is about individualism, it's about individual rights, it's about protecting minorities, and so in some ways those two things fit together very uneasily. And in fact, liberalism historically has kind of acted as a check on democracy, because with democracy, since what we're talking primarily about is elections, you have with democracies always the potential for tyranny of the majority, because in a democracy, whoever wins the election gets to rule. Liberalism puts limits on what those majorities can do. It says that there are certain individual rights that majorities cannot decide on, that there are certain things that we keep separate from the political process. And so those two things have fit together over the last decades in the West to give us the kind of democracy I think we've become used to. But historically, those two things have not gone together. And I think one of the things that we're seeing right now, that Yascha has written also a lot about, is that these two things are kind of separating, right? That there's a lot of difference between winning elections and the stuff that goes with liberalism. And a lot of the danger and a lot of the disjuncture that we're seeing, I think, particularly in Western countries, comes from the separation of those two things and the acceptance, perhaps, of elections, but not of all of the things we associate with liberalism.
And you can even have very illiberal democracy. You can even argue, as I think you have, Yascha, that you can have essentially in Turkey now an electoral dictatorship. You know, the majority might actually support a dictatorship. And maybe Poland is moving in a direction like that too.
So this is important to understand about these two different things, that they don't guarantee each other in the way that we used to believe, right? So there's these two big myths in political science that I think 15 or 20 years ago really were absolutely mainstream in the discipline and which have turned out to be quite wrong over the last years. And the first you already mentioned in your introduction, which is this idea that sure, democracies that don't have much of a tradition might easily collapse. Think of Kenya at the moment. Sure, countries that are affluent might just continue to be dictatorships for a long time. Think of China or the UAE. But once you have this stable, affluent democracy, it really is safe. It can't possibly collapse. Well, that has been proven wrong in the Hungarian case already, which has had many changes of government for free and fair elections, which is quite affluent. And so according to the standard theories of political science, it should be a stable democracy. And instead, I would argue that it's no longer truly a democracy. Now, the second theory that's also being called in doubt, I think, is this idea that liberalism and democracy really support each other, that once you have both of them locked in, one protects the other. That's not the case. One can slide, and once one of these things starts to slide, the other one starts to slide as well. And that's the development that we see in countries that have essentially become electoral dictatorships. So it starts with somebody, often a populist, saying, look, I truly speak for the people. Trust me, I'm the representative of the people who really count. And it's time for us to get rid of all of these sclerotic institutions that impede the popular will, of all of the elites that are self-serving. Just give me a little bit more power and I'll fix it. And at the beginning, that can nearly deepen democracy. It can make political systems more responsive to what people actually want. And the majority suddenly has a feeling that, yeah, we do get to determine our political fate much more than we did a few years ago. But what's the rub? Well, the rub is that once that authoritarian populist starts to control the media, abolish the independence of judicial institutions, take control of the police and other security forces, take control of the electoral commission, gerrymander the political system, well, then the democratic part starts to go away as well. Because even though you might still have elections, they're not free and fair elections. The opposition no longer has a real shot at displacing the government. And that's exactly what's happened in Hungary in the elections in March, and it's what's happened in Turkey, right? What we saw in Turkey on Sunday is an election in which over 300 journalists had been jailed in the last year and a half, over 100,000 state employees fired summarily from the job for supposedly being enemies of the people, all of the state media being pure propaganda outlets, private media being under substantial control by the regime, protesters often being beaten up, one of the leading opposition candidates having to campaign from jail. And so, sure, you had an election, as many newspapers called it, but it wasn't a real election. It was the kind of window dressing that you get in an electoral dictatorship.
Sheri, let's just back up for a minute and sort of take a global temperature. I mean, we've talked about Turkey and Hungary. What is the status of democracy today? You're a historian of democracy. You know, what is the barometer today? How serious is the threat? How global is it, in your opinion?
So that's a great question. I mean, we have been experiencing, obviously, some significant democratic erosion. If we're to look historically at previous periods when we've had what political scientists call democratic waves, that is to say times when many countries make transitions from dictatorship to democracy. In fact, from that kind of historical perspective, the late 20th and early 21st century does not look bad at all. In fact, it looks quite good. We have more democracies today, even if we were to exclude the kind of iffy ones, as Yascha and you pointed out, the illiberal ones, the ones that are democratic, you know, sort of in name only. We have many, many more democracies today than we've ever had in the past. So if we're looking purely at the state of democracy, that is to say the number of people or the number of countries that have democratic systems, then in fact we're doing better today than any time in the past. What is worrying in the sense of being historically unusual, as Yascha pointed out, is that we now have countries that have been considered, and in fact have been, fairly stable liberal democracies for decades. And by this we mean the United States, parts of Western Europe, that are now showing significant signs of decay. That is the historically unusual development, and therefore in some ways the most worrying, I would say.
I sense from reading much of what you've written, Yascha, that you're a bit less sanguine than Sheri may be about, you know, where you'd put the global meter.
A bit less sanguine. The main problem I have with ever appearing in public with Sheri is that we agree on too many things, and it's been a very uncomfortable position to have to agree with things. You know, it's a terrible thing for an academic and a writer to have to say, "I agree." So I mostly agree. One qualification and one elaboration on a point that Sheri made. The qualification is that, compared to 30 or 40 years ago, there's more democracies in the world today. There are more people living in democracies. So in that kind of time span, the news is good, and we should remember that. I do think that there's fewer democracies and fewer people living in democracies now than there were 12 years ago. So Larry Diamond shows quite well by using the Freedom House data that for each of the last 12 years, more democracies have made steps, more countries have made steps away from democracy than towards democracy. So we've now had a 12-year, what he calls democratic recession, and I take that argument quite seriously. But, as Sheri says, that may be part of a normal give and take of democracy. What we've seen historically is these democratic waves in which democracy expands to new countries, and you know what? It's really hard to make a democracy work, to make it take in that new territory, and so often in the following decades, democracy subsides a little bit. So think of 1848 and the wave of democratic revolutions in Europe. For a few years, there's a bunch of democracies in Europe. Well, 5 or 10 years later, a lot of them collapse again, so you see that kind of recession. So perhaps, there's none. Right? So perhaps that's what's going on here. Britain, depending on definition. Britain, depending on definition.
Britain wasn't a democracy in 1848.
All right, we can have that debate over a drink. We have a disagreement, hurrah. But I think the second point that Sheri made is the really, really crucial one, right? Because and you don't have to believe in Francis Fukuyama's theory of the end of history, which, by the way, is a much more subtle theory and book than most people tend to acknowledge. But you don't have to believe that in order to have had an essentially optimistic view about the world. And that consisted broadly in the following idea. You have this set of countries where democracy is safe. The countries which have had lots of changes of government, which are really affluent, places like the United States and France and Sweden and eventually Germany, right? And we know that democracy is safe there. Well, also we know that even if perhaps China will never be a democracy, we don't know about that, but over time other countries will get more affluent, a few of them will become democracies, and so over time we can expect the geographic range of democracy to grow. It's certainly not going to reduce, it's going to grow, right? And perhaps some countries that aren't stable might go away or something like that, but the set of countries where we really can rely on democracy is just going to keep getting bigger. Well, when you look at what's going on in Hungary, and I would say when you look at the things that weren't supposed to happen in countries like the United States and Italy and France and Germany, where theories predicted that you'd never get political candidates and parties that actually break with some of the most fundamental rules and norms of liberal democracy. When you suddenly see liberal democracy in the process of dying in a place like Hungary, and deeply threatened, I would say, in places like Italy and the United States, that fundamentally changes that prediction. Even if there's as many democracies today as there were 20 years ago, it means that 20 or 40 years from now, you might actually see some of those democracies that we took for granted collapsing. And so the view as to the prediction as to what the world is going to look like in 20 or 30 years becomes much more radically open than it would have been 10 years ago.
So Sheri, as a historian, what does it look like when a democracy is under threat? What are the warning signs that you see from your work and what you see around the world today?
So great question. So today, the threats to democracy look a little bit different than they might have looked at in previous waves, right? So if we think of previous times when a lot of countries made transitions to democracy after the First World War, Yascha said 1848, things like that. The kinds of ways democracy ends are the kinds of pictures we have in our mind of, the end of political regimes. Guys with tanks out on the streets, dictators taking over, violent suppression of opposition, those kinds of things. That's pretty much not the way things are going today, partially because expectations of citizens have changed. And so the kinds of threats to democracy you see today are not of the classical, again, dictator with the army out in the street type coups, fascist parties, communist parties, completely putting an end to all kinds of contestation. Now what you see is a more gradual erosion, an undermining, as Yascha said, of the kind of rules and norms of democracy, a hollowing out of democracy, until all that's left is that shell that we discussed at the beginning, right? There are elections, but they're essentially kind of meaningless. They're showpieces. They're a way for the leader of the government to say, look, I have popular support, but that popular support is, again, largely meaningless because the opposition, if not all jailed, if not all sort of violently oppressed, really don't have the power to actually, oppose the regime in any meaningful way. So now what we're looking at is this kind of slow drip, a more gradual erosion, and in some ways that's more dangerous because it's very difficult to know sometimes that you're on a slippery slope until you've fallen off to the bottom of it. And so I think that's another reason why people are perhaps concerned today, because it's not just that we're seeing erosion in places we historically might not have expected it, it's that it's very unclear both exactly what's going on and how concerned we should be about any one particular, again, tweet or norm erosion or something of that nature.
Yascha, do you agree? And let's take it back to the United States. What do you see here that leads you to believe that perhaps American democracy is under threat?
Stop asking me if I agree with Sheri, because I'll have to say yes, and it'll just be depressing. I do agree, and I am worried about the United States. Democracies rely. Look, it's fine for people to have strong disagreements with each other in a democracy. That's the point. It's fine for politicians to say, it's really important that I get elected because I'm smarter and I, have the more important political cause and I'm going to make the world a better place and the opponent is doing none of that. That's normal. It's even normal, unfortunately, that there's a little bit of rough and tumble and that you might say some mean things about your opponent, perhaps sometimes that you tell certain kinds of lies about it. You've seen that many times in American history. But what you also have to have is consensus around the basic rules that allow us to strongly disagree with each other. And then when we lose an election, to say, all right, you get to govern for a little while, but I know that 4 years from now, 8 years from now, I'm going to have a fair shot at winning the election then, and that's why I'll put up with that. Now, I do think that our president, Donald Trump, has violated those basic rules and norms over and over and over again. He has threatened to jail his political opponent. He does not accept the political opposition as a normal part of a democracy. He calls them traitors. He says that judges who disagree with him are enemies of the people, that the press should register as foreign agents rather than being allowed to do the job. And he also attacks some of the most basic forms of a separation of power and the rule of law. I think that sometimes, especially the business community, doesn't quite see the danger of that when it comes to journalists, politicians, even immigrants. But look at what Donald Trump tweeted this morning about Harley Davidson, which in response, frankly, to part of the misguided economic policies of the administration around free trade and tariffs, has decided to relocate some of the production facilities to Europe. And the president has specifically threatened this company with tax retaliation because of the business decision they took. Well, you might think that that's a bad decision. You might think that Harley Davidson should be producing in America. That's fine. But for the president of the United States to say, I'm going to use my power to punish you, an individual company, in that kind of way, is a very clear breach of a separation of powers. And it's not only one of the ways in which we see the president trying to go beyond the kind of authority which the Constitution invests in a duly elected president of the United States. It's also one of the ways in which I think people really underestimate the kind of long-term harm that this does. This is why you need the rule of law, so that you as a businessman can make your own decisions without worrying about whether you're going to fall in disfavor with a president. So that you as a citizen can say what you want without worrying about whether some kind of man in political authority is going to punish you for that. And we see in countries like Turkey and Russia and Hungary and Venezuela what kind of consequences it has over the long run when this is systematically violated.
But before we turn to causes, I just want to take an aside for a minute, because Sheri, you are an expert in what you've written on the interwar period on fascism. And I can't remember a time at Ideas Festivals in past years where that F word has been used as often as it has. Is that a useful word to describe the kind of populism that we see growing in various parts of the world, including the United States, or does it actually detract from clarity of thought and argument?
So that's a great question, because definitions, as you say, are supposed to clarify, and they're also supposed to lead us not just towards, again, understanding a phenomenon, but thinking about how to address it. So as a person who's spent a lot of time studying the history of the development and decay of democracy, I think historical analogies can be useful, but I think we have to be very careful how we use them. So I would say the fascism analogy is most useful as a kind of cautionary tale. This is what happens when people can't or won't defend their democracies, and therefore the opponents of it become increasingly emboldened and increasingly radical. I think we are not really anywhere near the interwar period, both because I think populists are neither as radical nor as strategic as their fascist counterparts were, and more important than that, I don't think the state of our democracy is anywhere near as perilous as the democracies of interwar Europe were, nor for that matter the state of our democracy when FDR came to power in the interwar period. There were much greater threats, both as far as economic and social conditions, and also as far as the kind of radicalism of those who were opposing not just him, but democracy. So I think we keep fascism in mind as, okay, look, this is what happens when we allow the conditions to get too far out of hand. But I don't think that we should think we're there yet, not only because I think, again, the historical analogy doesn't lead us there, but because I think it directs us towards very different reactions to what is going on. We still have the ability to use our democratic institutions and procedures in this country in a way that was not true, again, in many parts of interwar Europe. As bad as our economic and social conditions are, they are nowhere near as bad as they were in the interwar period, and we have a much greater ability through the political process to address them. When you're dealing with people, with parties who are absolutely not just anti-democratic, but anti-liberal, and determined to come to power to not just end the existing system, but to put into place an entirely revolutionary new one, your tactics for dealing with them are necessarily different, I think, than your tactics for dealing with a Trump or a Le Pen or an alternative for Germany, alternative for AfD in Germany. And so I think we want to keep that fascism analogy in our minds as this is what happens when we're not cautious, careful, and concerned enough. But if we throw that too far out, I think it leads us to deal with populists in ways that may very well be counterproductive.
Thank God we have a disagreement,
Okay.
or at least half of one. So I agree that the comparison to fascism is not helpful, but I actually think it's unhelpful for pretty close to the opposite reasons to what Sheri said. Which is to say that, when you say, oh, Trump is like Hitler and what people picture is precisely the old movie of how democracies end, right? What they picture is people with torches in the streets and performing the Hitler salute and so on. And then you look outside the window and you say, well, I'm not seeing that. So aren't all these people just hysterical and pretending that there's a danger when clearly this isn't happening? What are they on about, right? But when you look at how democracies have died in the last years, as Sheri said earlier, that's not what it looks like. It looks like somebody saying, look, just trust me. You're going to have allegiance to me, loyalty to me, not the Constitution. I'm going to fix it. I'm really talking for you. Everybody who disagrees with me is just an enemy of me, and by extension, an enemy of the people. So just let me expand my power a little bit. Let me break with some of those pesky rules and obstacles and all of that stuff, because I'm your man. Right? And over time, they assemble enough power that it's no longer possible to effectively resist them. And there's never any clear point where there's the putsch. There's never the generals in the streets. The system still claims to be democratic, as all of these countries do. I'm sure that America is going to call itself a democracy 20, 40, 60 years from today. The question is whether it will be one. Right? And so I think the fascism analogy is dangerous, not because there's less risk now. I think it's dangerous because when we make the fascism analogy, we underestimate the amount of risk we now face.
So let's talk. You have us all concerned, if we weren't concerned
Good.
already. What in your views, I'll ask each of you, are the fundamental causes of the situation we in the United States find ourselves, and as whether that's also applicable in some of the other countries, seeing these kinds of rises of populism and illiberalism.
All right. So I think it's really useful to think about causes in different categories. So I think there are some long-term causes that have helped to kind of destabilize our democracy and create a load of discontented and worried citizens. And I would put those two long-term causes in the economic and the social category. So the economic category we're probably all familiar with. Over the past decades, we've had relatively slow growth and highly inequitable growth. We have very high levels of inequality in the United States, somewhat less in Europe. We have even perhaps more perniciously very low levels of social mobility, which basically means that people don't see the opportunity for their children to do better. Also, the way growth has been distributed has been very unequal, not just within different socioeconomic categories, but geographically. And so what's basically happened is that these economic changes have created, again, incredible divisions within our society and a lot of worried and discontented citizens. The other long-term cause is social. There have been immense social changes over the past decades. Changes in the United States in demography, incredibly high levels of immigration now, not historically unprecedented, but close to historically unprecedented. The mobilization of minority groups obviously has made many citizens concerned about their place in society. We have somewhat similar trends in Europe, again, particularly with regards to levels of immigration. Now, those are long-term trends, right? But long-term trends, structural causes alone don't cause political problems. They only cause political problems when what you think of as the establishment, politicians, political parties, don't deal very well with them. So I think the medium-term cause of these problems is that the establishment, as the populists like to say, actually didn't respond very well or indeed at all to many of these changes, leaving them again to create kind of this wellspring of discontent among many citizens. So long-term changes, medium-term changes, that is to say, or medium-term causes in the sense of let's look at how our democracies, our democratic institutions, the establishment have responded. I would say not very well. And then I think the trigger for all of this, that is to say the shortest term causes, probably lie in a combination of the financial crisis and in Europe in particular, the refugee crisis, right? So it takes all of these things together, I think, to explain the position where we are today. And by breaking them up that way, again, I think it's helpful to think about the places where the breaks might have come and the places where we now might think about addressing some of the problems that we face. That is to say, dialing back some of the threats to democracy.
Yascha, the ideology, how do we get here?
So there's two really important points in what Sheri just said, right? I mean, so the first is that one mistake that people often make when we think about the causes of this is just to look at the United States, right? Now, you have the rise of very similar political movements with real commonalities in lots of different parts of the world. And so if you give an explanation that only works for the United States, but that doesn't work for any of these other countries, I think you're slightly begging the question, right? I mean, perhaps it is that the same thing happens in 20 different countries, and there's 20 separate stories that explain what happened in each, but that seems unlikely, right? When you get the same set of developments in 20 different countries, there probably are a set of common causes. So that's one important thing to remember here. The other important thing is to distinguish between the causes of this challenge to democracy and some of the symptoms of it, right? So it's tempting to look at how divided our public sphere is, how little civility one set of actors has for the other, the kind of institutional brinksmanship that we see, and say, well, this is the cause of what's going on. But that, again, strikes me as a mistake. I think the reason why we're seeing all of those things is that there's deeper structural drivers that have made people lose trust in politics, made people angry, made people not see the commonalities with each other, and so on, right? And so I think that we need to look at long-term drivers that apply in all of these different countries and that distinguish what's happening today from what happened 20 or 40 years ago when all of those countries were much more stable. Now, I'm going to say more about all of this tomorrow in my book talk at 7:45 a.m. in the Jerome Ballroom. But just very briefly, because I don't want to repeat too much for people who will come to that, but very briefly, I think there's three sets of things that are going on here. The first is a stagnation of living standards for ordinary citizens and the kind of lack of social mobility, so that people no longer have a sense that I'm doing much better than my parents were, and my kids are going to do better than me. The second is the slow, complicated transition from a set of mono-ethnic, monocultural societies in Europe, or ones that perceive themselves as being that, or in the United States and in Canada, from a set of multi-ethnic societies that had a really strict racial and religious hierarchy, to more equal multi-ethnic societies, and the kind of rebellion that inspires and some of the people who stand to lose from that. And then finally, the rise of the internet and of social media, which makes it much easier for extreme voices, for people who are frustrated by those other trends, to rebel against the existing political system.
Before we open it to the audience, I'd like to ask each of you questions about what we do about it, or what you would recommend citizens do about it. And there may be different answers if they're in Turkey or Hungary, which is perhaps already past some kind of a tipping point, as opposed to a citizen of the United States or France or many other countries. So short term, long term, you've both spoken in short and long term. What are the things that people in this audience and others can actually do about it?
So I think there's the tactical and there's the strategic, right? I mean, in the short run, and the elections in Hungary and Turkey really reminded me of that, it is absolutely important to get authoritarian populists out of power, or to at least get a real check on their power. What you see in many countries is that once authoritarian populists take over, they start to make the playing field a little bit uneven. They still have elections, but they cease being really fair. But the first time that they're up for re-election, the opposition usually retains a real, perhaps not quite a fair, but a real shot at displacing them. By the time that they're up for re-election the second or third time, that chance is usually gone. The opposition in Turkey had a minimal chance of winning the show vote on Sunday. And so making sure that you constrain the power of these authoritarian populists who don't agree with the basic rules and norms of the political system is the first order of priority. And it should be an order of priority even if ideologically you disagree with some of the things in the opposition, because you want to make sure that you preserve the institutions we need in order for ideological forces that have a commitment to democracy and that might be closer to some of your views to have a shot at subsequent elections. But all of this tactical stuff is not going to help us against the long-term structural driving forces that both Sheri and I talked about. So you also have to think about how you address those. How do you actually make sure that the average citizens once again can say, hey, you know what, my life's better than my parents' life was. My life's better than it was 20 or 30 years ago. Do I love politicians? Do I completely trust them? No, but you know what, they somehow seem to be doing fine by me. Right? You want to make sure that we figure out how to have an equal multi-ethnic society in which minorities feel welcomed and included and like they have a fair shot, but in which also the dwindling majority feels like they continue to have a real stake in the society. And finally, we need to figure out how to deal with the rise of social media, which in my mind it involves some regulation for sure. It doesn't involve forms of censorship, to which unfortunately some European governments are now tempted to accede. But it does also involve actually fortifying our political beliefs, convincing people of the importance of those civic values that we talked about earlier, of liberal democracy, of individual liberty and collective self-rule, so that they actually understand what's at stake and how these kinds of things might be endangered.
Sheri.
So let me reiterate maybe and expand a little bit on some of the points Yascha made. I think definitely from the short term, when you're facing a party or a politician who very well may be a fundamental threat to liberal democracy, the most important thing is checking that threat. And I think, again, we can see the importance of that when we look at places like Turkey and Hungary. In those places, the opposition remained incredibly divided up until the most recent elections, when, as Yascha said, the game had already been rigged. And so they spent as much time fighting each other as they spent fighting the looming threat to all opposition. And if we go back actually to the interwar period, we can see that as well, right? That is a characteristic that absolutely must be avoided. It's fine for opposition movements to, sort of differ amongst themselves, but when you're facing a fundamental threat, the time comes to put that threat front and center and your differences aside. So I think—
May I just jump down here to hype my little button, which is an idea that Benjamin Wittes, the editor of Lawfare, had. It's coalition of all democratic forces. And I don't mean Democratic Party, Republican Party. I mean by that it's a moment in which everybody who has a stake in our democracy needs to be willing to stand together across ideological divides.
Yeah. All right. So, and a great example of that actually was what happened in France at the last election, right? Where you had this kind of sense that, okay, look, once we had a choice between Macron and Le Pen, that we support Macron if we support liberal democracy, even if he's not our first candidate. That was very imperfect, but that's the type of thing I think that needs to be done. And so for the United States, look, even if you are a Republican and you don't love the Democratic Party, I think one might see the value of having the Democrats take at least one of the houses back, simply not just as a signal, but as an actual institutional check on Trump's ability to radicalize further. But again, from the longer term, we have to think about what has happened to our democracy, what has gotten us to this place, and how we can address it. And so in addition to the things Yascha said, if we're thinking about the United States, but I think this also holds actually for most European countries as well, there has been incredible division and polarization in our society. And this is a result, I think, not only of the failure of our political institutions, our parties, and our political leaders, but also of the incredible separation and division that's happened in our society. There's incredible data showing how separated we have become geographically, how much we now don't talk to or interact with people who differ from us politically, racially, and religiously. We now live, actually physically live in spaces, many Americans do, where we don't have a chance to interact on a quotidian basis with people who are different from ourselves. And this not only heightens a sense of fear and threat, but it obviously makes it very easy to demonize the other because you see nothing in common with them. And so there are really some underlying structural things that we need to do in addition to addressing, again, some of the pernicious economic and difficult social trends. We need to figure out ways to bring citizens from different backgrounds together, to address questions about basic education in our country, about what it takes to make democracy work, not why you should be a Democrat or a Republican, but what it takes to make democracy work, the kinds of preconditions for democracy, what the basic procedures and norms are. I think we have a lot of rebuilding of our citizenry and our community in the United States. That's the longer term goal. But in the short term, again, if you're facing a sort of fundamental threat, then that has to be front and center in what your political activity is directed at.
Okay, it's all up to you now. We have microphones as this is taped, and I think this woman right here, the microphone is coming to you. Name and a short question. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Mitzi Wertheim with the Naval Postgraduate School. In terms of our last election, one of the things that struck me was the media failed us because they were so coastal in the way they covered it. And we didn't get good information of what was going on in the center of the country. I mean, we didn't think about them. We didn't think about their problems. I'm struck by the complexity of all of these issues and how these disciplines really need to be intertwined to understand this. You can't just look at it through the political science lens or through the economic lens. I mean, it's my understanding in Britain that they intertwine both economics and political science. I think that's a real problem here. And my third question is about telling these complex stories to the general public so they can actually understand them. Now, I happen to believe, because of the complexity, a lot of this has to be done visually. But you have to figure out how to tell these stories to non-experts. And my view is you have to be able to tell them to 11-year-olds. Because you can't expect any of these folks to go back and read long academic reports. And my final comment is I think all academics should be required, whatever they write, they then have to take those ideas and put them in terms that the 11-year-olds can understand, because we as citizens, I believe, help support in one way, shape, or form, fund academic institutions, and I think you're not keeping us abreast of what we ought to know.
So how do Columbia and Harvard answer that question?
Well, I'm happy to start. So I'll start with your last point. I wholeheartedly agree with you. I think that one of the great things about having great universities is that they're a place for people to sit back and think about the problems of the day. But I think that we do, especially when those problems become pressing, have an obligation to do what we can to educate the public, not just our students, but the public more generally. I will say that I don't know if I would say silver linings because that seems a little odd, but I do think that you have seen much more engagement by social scientists, economists, political scientists, sociologists, and others. I think actually this conference is a great example of that. I'm a professor. There have been lots of professors here whose talks I've gone to who have done a great job, I think, of conveying in intelligent but straightforward ways what research says about problem X or problem Y. So I think that that is something that this moment has encouraged more of. I think we do have a great deal of educating that needs to go on in this country. Trump is a symptom and not a cause of our problems. There has been an incredible decay in, again, economic indicators, social indicators, trust in institutions, performance of institutions. I think this is a wake-up call for those who care about democracy to become re-engaged and to try to educate fellow citizens about the problems and about what other people in different parts of the country, in different communities are thinking.
So,
No, go ahead.
just a few thoughts here. So, look, I think that professors are doing a much better job at thinking about these issues at all than they were 2 years ago. 2 years ago in the academy, when I would make these arguments for democracies and battles, which now, every second panel at Aspen is about this, people say, well, aren't you a little bit of a Cassandra? And I would say, but Cassandra was right, damn it. But there was a real dismissal of this, right? And there's certainly an ongoing incentive in academia not to talk to the wider public. Once you have tenure, perhaps, but before that, it can be dangerous to your career, right? And so that is a problem. And that's improving a little bit. There are many professors around on campus right now and so on, right, who are talking about these things. But I think we still underestimate how many standards of deviation the average member of the general public is away from anybody who chooses to spend their free time, the money to come to a festival like this, right? And so there was a great clip from a show called Love Island, which is a very popular sort of Big Brother style reality TV show in Britain at the moment, in which the contestants were discussing Brexit. And the first contestant basically said, so we're moving physically away from the European Union? Like we're going to tow our island away from it somehow? And I said, no, that's not the case. We're just politically leaving it. And the third person said, yeah, so we're not going to be able to go on holiday in Spain. And the fourth person said, well, that seems bad, then perhaps I'm against Brexit, right? So we have to think about how we engage that level of political knowledge. And I'm trying to do that a little bit through consulting, for example, on a computer game that deals with some of those issues and so on. But that can't be up to professors. It also has to be up to Hollywood, to the gaming industry, to television, to many, many other people in our society who need to understand that they too have a moral responsibility to invest resources in this and to make this work. Think of some of the great movies like Casablanca that were produced in World War II to try and understand, through the lens of a romantic drama, the stakes of a world. I'm not seeing much of that in Hollywood today, and that I, as a professor, can't deal with.
So to allow you all to get to your next sessions, we have time perhaps for one other quick question. And let's go on this aisle, if there is one. Yes, right here. Thank you, Sam.
Isn't it time for the development of a moderate centralist party and out of the division between the current political situation? There's people of goodwill in both parties that are tired of the old politics. Seems to me that you could develop something in the middle that would agree and be sane.
So I have some sympathy for that. I think there's a lot of people who have relatively moderate political views, and it would be important to be able to represent them more adequately. And there's some ideas about how we can actually reform the voting system in the United States in ways that wouldn't require a constitutional amendment to make it easier for there to be a greater variety of political representation. But ultimately, I don't think that's the solution, right? There's a lot of people in this country who are pretty liberal. There's a lot of people in this country who are pretty conservative. What we need is a political party on the left and a political party on the right which can have real disagreements with each other, who can have real fights about what our society should look like, but which are both equally committed to the ideals of liberal democracy. So look, as you will have guessed, I'm a liberal, not a conservative, but I think the best thing we could get in this country to save our democracy is a functional, sane, conservative party that has constitutional values.
Sheri, last word.
So one of the interesting things, if you look at survey data, is that there's actually much more agreement among Americans on policies than our politics actually reflects. So if you look at even the most contentious issues, immigration, gun control, abortion, actually the opinions people have are less polarized than our politics, right? This is actually a very puzzling finding in some ways, except when you think about the state of politics. There is, I think, much more agreement among American citizens on the abstract, or rather on the concrete issues, than there is about their parties. And so that creates an opportunity for people working within the parties, and I would say particularly the Republican Party, because it's very clear from all of our research that that party has moved further to the right than the Democrats have moved to the left, to try to move that party, think of a moderate Tea Party, if you will, back a little bit towards the center, because actually people's views about the issues are not as polarized as their politics actually is. So there is a potential there, I think, for this kind of moderation without a kind of third-party breakout, which I think is what you were perhaps suggesting.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank Sheri and Yascha.